The following podcast contains information and real stories about sexual assault and or violence which may be triggering to survivors.
From sporting
in the morning newspapers, a third allegation of sexual assault. By afternoon,
had to
a
fight to
fourth.
share her story of sexual abuse.
Bravery and the strength of Grace Tame.
Another
and
former
people like
staffer
her.
alleging the man had run his hand up her thigh in a
haven't
cattle
seen this
bar.
process of child grooming.
After a rape allegation and a question-time sex scandal.
woman who bled heavily.
In 2016, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimated that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced some form of sexual crime since the age of 15. On top of that, most major studies indicate that 25% of young women between ages of 15 and 21 will experience some form of sexual crime within that 6-year time frame. This is far too high. In a time where the world is changing so fast, sexual crimes seem to be regularly dominating the news, which begs the question, why is this and how can we help prevent it? I'm your host, Byron Dempsey, a 22-year-old podcaster from Sydney, Australia. Join me as I interview Brent Sanders, one of Australia's most respected communicators in the field of sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in secondary schools and universities. He may have been to your school. Having spoken to over 900,000 students on the subject, this podcast aims to educate young people around the reality of sexual crimes and the severity of these crimes. Together, we explore the legal definitions as well as the ethical and moral, wrapping these up in metaphors and stories in an easy to listen to and easy to understand way. Welcome to this episode. Welcome everybody to the podcast. My name is Byron Dempsey and I'm joined by Brent Sanders. Really looking forward to this podcast. This is going to be the intro for the show. I just want to talk a little bit what the show's about, who you are, your story, why you do what you do. We're going to be covering multiple different topics over this first season, specifically around sexual assault, violence against women, everything around that realm, everything that you talk about at your school talks. And I did want to preference, the whole reason this podcast kind of came to be was I had you on my podcast called Driven Young, which is my main podcast, and we got so much traction on that and so much awareness around that and comments on TikTok of everyone saying how important this is. I kind of realized, how can we take it to the next level? How can we really put your information out there so the world can kind of see it? So before we go into a little bit more about that, I'd love to know your story, who you are, what you do, and why you do everything you do.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. I think we first met when you were in year 10.
That's right.
Back a few years, 10 or so years ago.
A long time ago, yeah.
At your high school. I transitioned from the police environment. I was in the police through the 80s into the 90s. 1995, I'd done a little bit of work in sex crimes in that environment. And I was delivering a few talks around criminal profiling, and I got approached by a woman from the New South Wales Education Department to ask if I would be interested in putting some modules together for senior secondary school to raise awareness around sexual crime, consent, personal safety. So I've been working in this space for about 25 years. I speak often to around about 1,000 students a week in different schools, also universities. I'm based in Sydney, here in Australia, but I've delivered these talks in all state and territories around the country. And for me, I go in, primarily I do talks to students from about age 15 and up, and we cover areas of talking about consent, what consent is, what it is legally, some sort of hands-on sort of advice with regards to consent, also looking at the myths around consent. We talk about, awful sexual crimes like rape. We talk about sexual assault. I find that in the talks that I do, many people come forward to say that even if the talk is a couple of hours, some of them are longer, 3 hours, some of them are a full day, my goal is to have young people walk away from those talks with more knowledge, more information, so ultimately we can increase awareness in this space and reduce the likelihood of these terrible crimes occurring.
Yeah, and it's so important. Like, the reason my podcast is practical life skills we don't learn in school, and one of the reasons I want to bring you on, because I think we should be learning this stuff in school. Imagine if your talk was part of the curriculum and everyone in Australia was getting this information. I genuinely believe there would be less crimes like this being committed.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Interestingly, when I visit universities, I'm often asked to present a talk as part of like orientation week to first-year students who are arriving in the university system. Particularly here in Sydney, where the bulk of my work is done, a very high percentage of those students have actually gone through my talks before they get there.
Right.
And what's interesting is those who haven't will often come forward and say, I'm 18, I'm 19, why did I have to wait until university to actually hear what consent is and all these things. And you're right. Look, I think there is some inclusion in school curriculum around this, but respectfully, that's only ever going to be as good as the person presenting it. And this is quite an intricate area of law and things such as that. And very easily, with a little bit of knowledge, you can be taken outside of your comfort zone, and misinformation can often be as bad as no information at all. So it's a tricky one, Byron. I agree that, and there's been a lot of talk in the media more recently about introducing discussions like this at a younger age, and I agree with that premise. Now we need to ask, okay, how do we best do it? And it's got to be an age-appropriate type of a discussion to have. No good talking to Year 7 students about defensive driving because it's a million miles away from where their head is. You need to be cautious talking to Year 7, Year 8 students about sexual crime and things such as that. Do we talk to them about consent and respect? Yes, we do, but probably in a different context to how I would have spoken to you or young people in Year 10 about consent and that application for young people at that age.
Because at Year 10, we're just about to start drinking. We're not 18, but 16, people start drinking, illegally, and parties, which is where a lot of this stuff happens for young people.
Definitely.
And so, and look, there's so many variables when it comes to this. Obviously, this is a podcast we have no idea how old the listener's going to be. So you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt and apply it to your life. I also wanted to talk about just how each law is different in each state and each country.
Yeah.
So depending if you're international, if you're in Australia, we won't go too much into the law of New South Wales because it's too specific.
Yeah.
But you should do your own research of what state or territory you're in.
Definitely. That's a really good point, Byron. Even if we just look at Australia as a model, each state and territory has slightly different wording and terminology around, let's say we're talking about sexual crime, because each state has its own Crimes Act or the equivalent to it. As we go through the podcast, when we're using terminology, I'll probably use the terminology that we use in New South Wales as a base point. But as you say, as an example, when we're talking about sexual crime, a term like rape, which is awful, terrible term, but everyone's heard of it. Many are surprised to hear that there's only actually 2 states in Australia where the term rape is still used as a legal term, Victoria and Queensland. Every other state and territory has changed that label. Now, in the scheme of things, we could argue, well, who cares what they call it? And that, I guess that's valid. My point, I guess, would be when we're having these discussions, it's important that we're using terminology which is accurate. But of course, what's accurate for New South Wales is different to what is accurate in Queensland. So look, whenever possible, I will be talking about the definitions of these terms because they remain very, very consistent.
Yes.
We may have different labels state to state and internationally, but the definitions are very, very close. We might have, we're going to be talking at some point about the consequences for crossing the line legally with regard to sexual crime. Now, they can vary from state to state, but when we look at that variance, it's fairly close. Okay, so you're right, but as a point, and I think it's a valid one to the folks listening to this, if you're outside of New South Wales, some of the terminology that I may use may be subtly different to what applies in your particular state. But you can access that information very easily online.
Yeah, I guess what I would love to see is, first of all, we want to provide information here, but also be the spark that ignites a flame for people to go research themselves.
Sure.
If we can provide a baseline thing and they can go research, or at least just become self-aware.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned consequences. For me, when you did your talk and you gave us the reality of the consequences, that blew my mind.
Right.
And it's not like I was ever going to commit a crime like that, but hearing 14 years for that, and you told us real stories of people who had sat in your talks and you had been involved in cases where, 18-year-old boys had been serving 14 years in prison and all this different stuff. And it's like, wow, that really made me realize how serious this thing is.
Yeah. Look, we shouldn't be, and I don't think we are, and certainly my talks aren't purely driven by consequence, but it's certainly part of the pie. You're right. For me, when we look at inappropriate conduct and behaviour, we have the moral, the ethical issues at play, but then we also have the legal consequences. So they're part of the pie. And I think with young men in particular, consequence can raise awareness. And it's the same for all things in life. When you're little and you put your hand on the oven or on the hot plate, it's like, the consequence, so you don't do it again. In an essence, when we're talking about inappropriate behaviour at any level, part of the discussion needs to say, if you choose to cross this line, once there are consequences. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it's part of the discussion. And as you rightly say, Byron, as a young man who sat through my talks, one of the things that stays with you is aligning an action with a legal term and then the consequence. And I think that can adjust people's decision-making, because when we're making choices, when we're making decisions, part of the process is evaluating the consequence, whether it's driving, whether it's anything at all. So it's certainly part of the discussion. And I think it's a part that, as you mentioned too, that people perhaps are a little bit unaware of with regards to where an action fits into the law and what the likely consequences are. And, at the end of the day, if I'm speaking to a group of 100, 150 young men, some of them may be discouraged due to being made aware of consequences. So that for them may work. Others may say, well, I wouldn't do that anyway, so the consequence was of interest to me, and it confirmed in my mind that another reason why I wouldn't do it. Yeah.
And I guess so much of it comes down to ethics, right?
Yeah.
You being as a good human, what are your ethics? And and we'll get into all of that later on.
And one of the things that I find myself saying often when I'm talking to young men in talks, and Byron, you probably heard me saying it in your talk, that young men can make bad choices. That doesn't excuse the behaviour. But my take there is we can reduce the likelihood of bad choices made by good young men by raising awareness around consequence and where these lines are. For some people, a talk that I do or that others do sadly won't make a difference, and they will choose to make the choices that they make. For others, who could have crossed a line that they may not have quite known where it existed, or they're unaware of consequence, it may well stop that person from crossing that line. Definitely.
And that says so much of it comes down to education. I believe education is, the foundation of our society. No one's born a racist. No one's born with these things. We're educated, whether it's negatively or positively. So if we can provide this education, as you mentioned, maybe even earlier, I think there's so much we can do.
Sure.
But so the reason we're starting this podcast is, everything you just mentioned, but for me, it's like the numbers are just unbelievable for young women specifically. I'm sure you get into it, but you mentioned stats about women aged between 16 and 22.
15 to 21. Don't mean to pull you up on those numbers
No,
there, but you're right.
21.
15 to 21 in Australia has always been recognised with major studies as a high-risk age group for young women to be targeted for a sexual offence. If we put that alongside the risk for young men, the risk for young men is actually when they're a lot younger, when they're boys at primary school. So when I'm speaking to boys in this space, I often say, because I'm speaking often to boys year 9, year 10 up, other people go into primary school and do talks in this space who perhaps don't talk in high school. One thing I say to young men when I'm talking to them is the high-risk age group for you has pretty much passed. Now, having said that, I speak to 40,000 students a year, and if you did that, you, like me, would speak to young men, 15, 16, 17, 18, who may have been recent targets for sexual crime. But it's very rare in comparison to the likelihood of young women.
Yeah.
So risk for males in Australia is at primary school. That's the high risk for boys. They're at higher risk statistically than the girls are at primary school. That's why we see things like the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse, close to 5,000 people who came forward as adults to give evidence in that. Over 90% were male.
Wow.
And that's because they were putting a spotlight on sexual crime committed in institutions, schools, through the churches and things such as that, against very young children. Greatest risk to young boys at primary school comes from adult males in positions of care and control. Now, when we get up to that 15 to 21 age group, the risk for boys being targeted is very low, but across the gender divide, when we look at young women, they're in their highest risk. So they've now moved into their highest risk age group, 15 to 21. Most major studies come in Australia at between the age of 15 and 21, around about 1 in 4 young women will experience some form of sexual crime.
Can I just clarify?
Time frame.
Is that crimes that have been reported?
No.
So that's estimated without reporting.
Yeah, that's without reporting. So where do they get those statistics from? Universities are a major source for that type of information. We often do major studies in universities with 10, 20, 30,000 surveys done. And they will go through a list of to describe behaviours, and you sort of ask, has this ever happened to you? Has this happened to you? Has this happened to you? Now, many of the people who are filling out those surveys may not even be aware that indicates a sexual crime. So when we look at reporting, as with all studies done anywhere in the world, reporting of sexual crime is very low. Incidence of sexual crime, very high. So reporting a sexual crime would be the lowest reported crime category that there is. So we're not talking about reporting. What we're saying here is between the age of 15 and 21 for young women, around 25% of the Australian population, female population in Australia, in that 6-year time frame will experience some form of sexual crime. Now, some form of sexual crime doesn't mean it's all the top end offences, but these are crimes punishable by imprisonment. And later in the podcast, we're going to be talking a little bit about definitions of crime. We have the main one, of course, sexual intercourse without consent, but we also below that have a crime of unlawful sexual touching without consent, which is still punishable by imprisonment, is in fact statistically more common than intercourse without consent.
Everyone, I think all my girlfriends would have experienced it at one point. We'd in a party, in a train. I was talking with someone, and she was just saying, "Yeah, actually, I realized I was about 25 in a train. I definitely got indecent assault, or I got assaulted in that way."
Yeah,
but we don't realize it. We just kind of go, "Oh, that was really uncomfortable."
Yeah, look, you're right. I'm often asked when I go into schools, do these laws apply in school? Because this happened to me yesterday at lunchtime.
Yeah, wow.
God. Coming back to that, high risk and the gender risk profile, for want of a sort of a catchy term, gender risk profile is such that we look at the gender of the people we're looking at and the risk profile for them. And certainly the age group that I speak to, the gender risk profile indicates that young women are at high risk in the age that I speak to be targeted. The flip side to that too, Byron, is when we ask the question, okay, who is most likely to be responsible for a sexual offence committed against a young woman aged 15 to 21? Well, the research is undeniable. And in fact, I get disclosures every week. And most of them, almost all of them, the person who has committed the offence against the young woman aged 15 to 21 is usually a male of similar age who the young woman knows socially, who she thought that she could trust. And this perhaps challenges another myth around sexual crime, that sexual crime is predominantly committed by strangers. It's not. It never has been. But that myth, if I could use that term, perhaps starts when we're very little in primary school and we get the stranger danger message, which is a really valid message, but the percentage of sexual crimes committed by strangers against primary school aged children in all major states is less than 2%. That doesn't mean we don't talk about it. But what happens when you give that message to a little child who's 6 or 7? It's a very clear message in the mind of a child. Strangers are dangerous. Strangers are dangerous. People we know are safe. So if I stay away from strangers, I stay away from danger. The stranger danger message is very effective in highlighting for children what to do if they are confronted by a stranger. But over 98% of sexual crimes committed against primary school aged children is committed against them by people they think they can trust, who in fact, respectfully, the stranger danger message tells them they can trust. Family members, extended family, friends. Even when we get up into the sort of the high school, university age group, when we're looking at sexual crime, strangers even less than at primary school. So look, it's an issue, don't get me wrong. And we've had a terrible case on the news more recently from the UK where it's alleged that a police officer abducted and murdered a young woman. Now look, we had a terrible case like this in Victoria just a few years ago with a young woman walking home after meeting friends after work. She was abducted, raped and murdered. These are terrible, terrible cases. And when we hear of them, it brings into our lives a real example of what we see in TV, in the movies, on Netflix, on Stan. It is. And it taps into all those ingrained fears going right back to primary school. And that little voice in the back of our head says, see, strangers are dangerous. And they can be. And the protest marches that evolve after that, they're huge. I know down in Victoria, when they had the case down there, and it's remiss of me not to know more detail about it, some years ago now, they had a protest march, like a Take Back the Night march down in Victoria, a very peaceful, quiet march where thousands of people marched. They thought they'd get about 4,000. They got 40,000 people that marched. And it's this outpouring of grief of all these different emotions. And it's interesting from a statistical viewpoint that, we don't have that same attachment to sexual crimes committed in relationships or parties or things such as that.
Because these stories, they are horrific. They're so media, like they're so marketable through the media, and so it gets such big reach. Like this incident that happened in England is horrific, and it's very traumatizing to a lot of people. I've seen a lot of girls are feeling very uncomfortable about it, and they're going, they want to be able to have carry mace, which I actually think is not a bad idea.
Sure.
But the bigger issue isn't strangers, as we mentioned. Like we need to be highlighting the statistics, which are the bigger issue is actually someone you know. Yeah,
the irony with this, Byron, is you're right. We're very, you and I, all of us, we're very, we're very sort of open to media suggestion with this, because that's where we get our information from, be it social media, online, or other forms of media. And the irony is, the rarer the form of sexual crime, the more likely it is to get media coverage. So these horrific, terrible crimes, like this young woman who had her life taken in the UK, the young woman down in Victoria some years ago, they get massive media coverage, and they're terrible crimes, and people become connected to it via the media. But they're exceedingly rare crimes. It doesn't mean that when they happen, they're not horrific. They are, and they tap into all those emotions. But the far, far more likely form of sexual crime are the ones that we don't hear about.
It's very easy to be scared of strangers and put strangers as a villain, but when it's your boyfriend or a guy you know to you, or it could be your uncle or something, which is more realistic, it's not as, people don't want to accept that.
Yeah. So look, there's lots of different angles here, but look, having said that, in some of the longer presentations I do address the psychology of serial offenders, stranger offenders, and we may in fact put some of that together in the podcast at some point. I've spent 25 years amongst other areas profiling serial sex offenders. I was lucky enough to write the first book published in Australia in that space. So I've profiled probably 30 to 40 serial offenders who are strangers who go out and select, tragically, mainly women, at random. And although statistically there is a very low likelihood of that crime crossing a person's path, there wouldn't be a woman listening to this podcast who hasn't at some point thought, what would I do if that was me? What would I do if it was me walking home from a friend's place, or getting out of an Uber, or whatever the case may be, or getting from a train, from a bus, walking home? What would I do if that classic stranger, say, pulled up in a car, stood out from behind a tree or whatever, and confronted me? And so there is some work that we can do in that space by looking at the psychology of those offenders, historically what works and what doesn't. There's a lot of work that has been done in that space. We've been profiling serial sex offenders, or gathering information on them for, in fact, close to 50 years. So there is a lot of information there, and it's information which is often quite enlightening to those if it's presented correctly. So we might look at that as we go through a bit later.
Absolutely. And, because this is just intro, and I actually we'll do a whole episode on stranger danger, because I think it's so important. I just wanted to highlight, yes, that is a big thing. Yes, it's horrific and it's scary, but the bigger issue is actually more underlying. And that's what I want this podcast to be about. My problem with these riots and stuff and what's happening right now is a big goes up, lots of people talk about it, and then it kind of fizzles out and we're back to where we started. Whereas I want to provide education constantly. You've been talking for 20, 25 years about this. Yeah,
look, and there's been a lot of talk, particularly in Sydney, but across Australia. We're at a time at the moment here, as we're putting this podcast together, where sexual crime, inappropriate sexual conduct has been on the front page of the papers, and at front of mind in people's discussions now for 3 or 4 weeks. There's the issues that have come out of Parliament, which is everyone's very mindful of, and some more stories came out just overnight. There's the Chanel Contos survey that the young woman who was an ex-student of a private girls' school in Sydney, who out of frustration, very much talking to friends, most of whom had experienced sexual crime, sort of put up a survey. I think it was on her Instagram account, and within something like 48 hours had over 3,000 young women who had experienced sexual crime. And that put a real spotlight on, okay, what are we doing about this? Are we talking about this? What are the schools doing about this? And I look at any of that discussion as a good thing, because it raises awareness. And and we can never do too much on this, but I think for mine, like I go into schools and I do my talks, it's really good to be able to conclude my talks by saying to those in attendance, hey, if you want to revisit this information, here's where you can do it. Now, people can get hold of my book, people can go online, but I think podcasts, particularly for the age group that I speak to, is a very accessible way to access this information and promote that discussion. Or if friends are sitting around and they start talking about this and they want to revisit some information, really cool to be able to have a podcast or something at their fingertips where they can say, well, let's go and have a listen. Let's just clarify a few of these things legally and otherwise.
Absolutely. That's exactly my vision with the podcast as well. So yeah, that's kind of the introduction to this podcast. We're going to get into consent. We're going to get into stranger danger. We're going to be getting into the consequences. We're going to be asking a lot of frequently asked questions. What if one person's drunk and the other person's drunk? That comes up a lot, I know. So we're going to get into all that. Hopefully you guys enjoy. I will add on to what you're just saying. This podcast can be better timed. We're filming this, what's the date? 23rd of March, 2021. We've got stuff going on in Parliament. We had this violence thing had to happen in the UK. David Dobrik's under fire, who's a big YouTuber about sexual assault. His whole team, so it's worldwide right now. So there's all stuff going worldwide around sexual assault and everything that's happening in that world. So this is, funny enough, weird timing, because we organised this before all the stuff went down.
Yeah, look, we did, and I think also overnight, this is probably more an Australia thing, an eastern coast of Australia issue, a very high-profile rugby league player, Jared Hayne, who played for Australia, went to the States and played professional football, I think for the San Francisco 49ers, came back. He was found guilty overnight of 2 sexual assaults and is now facing imprisonment. He's being sentenced, I think, in early May. So this again will be another story on the front page of the papers headlining the news, as we always get when high-profile individuals such as he, not only charged but go through the court system and are found guilty. So lots of chat about this at the moment.
Yeah, and it just highlights how big of an issue this is. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Brent, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll get into the rest of the episode.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for making it all the way through this episode. After hearing the contents of this podcast, many may realize the sad reality of what has happened to them. If this is you and you seek help or guidance on what to do next, please click the link in the show notes. It'll redirect you to some resources as well as a helpline if you want to talk to someone anonymous. As you'll hear in other episodes, Brent and I do mention how important it is to start talking to someone, whether that's a family member, a friend, or it could be someone anonymous on a helpline. They are trained professionals, and we highly recommend you start this conversation. As you'll hear as well, in no way do you have to report this crime. This is completely up to you, but know that there are resources and links provided in the show notes below should you seek guidance.